On the line with us is Will Sommer, the politics reporter for the Daily Beast, the host of the Fever Dreams podcast, author of a brand new book just released titled Trust the Plan, The Rise of QAnon and the Conspiracy That Unhinged America. Website, of course, thedailybeast.com. His Twitter handle, Will Sommer, WILLSOMMER. And once again, the book is Trust the Plan. Will, welcome to the program. Tell us about tell us about QAnon. I realize it's a huge question. I'm not quite sure where to begin. Maybe we should start with the impact that QAnon is having on Americans.
Sure. Yeah. So, this is something that emerged a few years ago with this anonymous figure named Q. And basically it convinced a whole lot of people that the world is run by a satanic cabal and that Donald Trump's going to save the planet. And so in my book, I wanted to kind of get out across America and find out the impact QAnon was having. And the reality is, it's not great. I mean, to sum it up, everything from really motivating a lot of people for their roles in January 6th to destroying families or even inspiring gangs of kidnappers. It's really wreaking havoc.
When I lived in Germany for a year back in the 80s and did a real deep dive into the religion of the Nazis. I knew a few Nazis, repentant Nazis, but people who were quite elderly at that time and have passed away since, but were in Hitler's armies and a couple of them were true believers. And one of the things I found was, I read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this Russian intelligence service disinformation campaign from the 19-teens. And the more I dug into it, the more, looking back on it, Wilfred Diam was this one writer who published a magazine called A Star that Hitler was a big fan of. And it was kind of it was so similar to QAnon, that it spooks me looking back on it. I'm wondering how much of QAnon is actually derived from that old anti-Semitic stuff, or alternatively, are these just the kinds of religious tropes that happen over and over and over again throughout history, not always, picking on Jews, but picking on, whole varieties of people in different cultures and in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Tom. At its core, and this is often what the surface QAnon believer doesn't think, but at its core, QAnon is based on these anti-Semitic ideas that go back to the Middle Ages. So this idea of the blood libel, that Jewish people drink children's blood or use it to create the bread at Passover.
Exactly.
Back to the 13th century. And then suddenly we see this reemerge in QAnon where they're saying, well, these figures in banking, in Hollywood, in the Democratic Party, George Soros, they're terrorizing children in satanic rituals so that they can stay young and drink their blood. So really, it's almost a one-to-one thing. And it's obviously disturbing to see it reemerge in the modern day.
Yeah, but how widespread is this both in the United States and around the world, Will?
I think certainly more than a lot of people realize. I mean, even the most conservative polls will put belief at QAnon at between 3 and 7% of Americans. And that number gets larger when you say something like, do you think the world is controlled by a satanic cabal, et cetera? Mm-hmm. So, we're easily talking in the millions of Americans. And QAnon has spread all over to Germany and France and Japan. In Germany, just recently, there was a group of people in the security services there who were arrested for plotting a QAnon-style coup, that they were QAnon believers. Very similar thing in France. So, unfortunately, this has really spread across the world.
Whoa. So how extensively has QAnon penetrated the Republican Party?
I think really the GOP, I mean, certainly we can think of a hardcore QAnon believer like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's now one of the most prominent members of the House Republicans. At the same time, I think Republican leaders have been really reluctant to criticize QAnon. I have a part in the book where initially when it's emerging, people ask Kevin McCarthy about it. And he says, well, that's ridiculous. These people obviously have crazy ideas. There's nothing to it. And then maybe a year later, as QAnon gets more powerful and it's an election season, he suddenly says, Oh, I've never heard of such a thing. I can't comment on that. So, I think Republican leaders have looked away and allowed it to grow. And in the case of Donald Trump and some of the people around him, they've really actively courted it. Donald Trump on his social media network will post all these QAnon memes, pictures of him wearing a Q, stuff like this. And so, these people are being courted as sort of a hardcore pro-Trump demographic, when really they're a violent group of people.
What is the level of, and please remind me to get back to the violence, because that's something that I'd like to drill down in a little farther into. But I'm curious what the overlay is between QAnon and contemporary evangelical, by and large, white Christianity in the United States.
It's huge, particularly when you're talking about Pentecostal movements or charismatic evangelical groups. So often I run into that collision. And I think particularly when you have these church leaders who hold themselves out as contemporary prophets, that they're getting these revelations from God. I don't think it's that much of a jump for believers then to say, well, maybe I'm getting this revelation from a guy named Q. When I go to these QAnon conferences, these are people who see themselves, they think the devil is real, he's a real guy out there, and that they are in battle with him. And so really this matches very well with contemporary evangelical Christianity.
Right, so you said that QAnon has violence at its core, or tell us about the association between QAnon and violence.
Sure, so at its core, QAnon, it promises this moment called the storm, in which Donald Trump will return to power and impose sort of a fascist dictatorship on America. Now, they think that's a great idea, and that he'll execute all his enemies. So you have this fascist dream at its heart, and you're telling people that their opponents, their political opponents, are doing the worst things you can imagine to children. So it's probably no surprise then that eventually, especially with so many guns in America, some of these people start taking action. In my book, I get into a group of QAnon believers that plotted to kidnap children from foster homes. It ultimately ended in a murder. A QAnon believer in a separate case murdered the head of a national mafia family because he thought he was arresting him for Q, according to police. There's really all of these cases. I know of at least 2 cases where QAnon believers are accused of murdering their own family members because of their beliefs. So, I feel like often this stuff doesn't get the press. And I'm just trying to flag for people that the risk these conspiracy theories have as they grow from something, the sort of ridiculous thing online, into something that unfortunately is very serious.
There's a story in your book about the father of a QAnon believer who says, you don't have any idea how bad this is. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, this is a really heartbreaking story. I think this is one of the sort of lesser known tragedies of QAnon, but one that is taking place all over the country. Really, I'd imagine, I think in every city in the country, is a family that's been ripped apart by QAnon. One day your spouse or your parent or your child comes home and says, starts basically talking nonsense, and worse, they're mad that you won't support them and join them in believing in this. So in this case, I followed a family in the Midwest for about a year as their adult son slipped into QAnon. And this father, who was a kind of blue collar guy who had been so repulsed by Trump that after being a Republican, he'd become a liberal. And he was just so sad to see his son, start saying, oh, Tom Hanks is a pedophile, he's going to get arrested, and sort of turn off from the world and retreat into this online community. And, he didn't feel he had to get a job because soon this utopian QAnon moment would come. And so they would fight constantly. And so it was a very sad situation. And as you said, the quote there where his message was that this can really reach so many people who think you won't be affected by QAnon and until suddenly someone gets sucked into it.
I've seen, in over the course of my life, and particularly in my teenage years and early 20s, people kind of slide away from me and the social circle that we were all part of because they embraced Mormonism. In one case, a friend became a Jehovah's Witness. Lesser, other religions, but, some of these religions tend to be very, very insular and very, kind of cult-like. That's apparently what you're describing. Is that a very common characteristic with QAnon, that it essentially tears families apart, or are some people just quietly supporters of QAnon and not evangelical? I guess the question is, how evangelical is QAnon? Is evangelism at its core?
Yeah, really the heart of the QAnon message is, and part of its appeal is that it gives the average believer something to do. And so it says, look, this moment where Donald Trump's going to arrest all these people, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, as I said, Tom Hanks, everyone, these people who are thought of, well regarded by many Americans, and he's going to expose them as these devil worshipers and child abusers. And so as QAnon believers, we have to spread the word about the truth of these people before that moment comes, or there will be a civil war. And they call this kind of calling they have the Great Awakening. And of course, there's obviously a religious overtone there. And so this idea that the QAnon believer has to get out and spread the word is really core to its message.
And that, the evangelism that is at the core of Christianity, arguably, is the reason why it has spread so far around the world. And it's absolutely fascinating. Will, he's doing great work here. Will Sommer is the politics reporter with the Daily Beast, host of the Fever Dreams podcast, and he's got a new book out, just released this week or the last week. Trust the Plan: The Rise of QAnon and the Conspiracy That Unhinged America. You can follow Will at Will Sommer, Sommer, on Twitter. Will, thanks a lot for dropping by today.
Thanks a lot, Tom.
Great talking with you. 17 minutes past the hour.